The alien princess wed the reserved human, unaware that he was a champion. The memo landed in my inbox at 7:43 in the morning, sandwiched between a reminder about the office water cooler maintenance and a calendar notification for a budget review I had no interest in attending. It was 3 sentences long. It told me that I had been selected to represent Earth in a matrimonial accord with the Velthara High Court. It told me my participation was voluntary. It told me to confirm by end of business. I read it twice. Then I poured a second cup of coffee, sat back down at my desk, and confirmed. My name is Kale Oren. I am 34 years old. I work as an archival translator in the sub-basement of the United Earth Diplomatic Annex, in a room that most of my colleagues do not know exists. My job is to take dead alien languages from recovered data cores and turn them into something a human being can read. I am very good at this. I am also very quiet about being good at it, which has always suited me just fine. People who meet me tend to remember very little about the encounter afterward. I am not tall. I am not loud. I do not dress in a way that invites commentary. My supervisor once described me, in a performance review I was not supposed to see, as reliably present and pleasantly forgettable. I kept that phrase. I thought it was possibly the best professional compliment I had ever received. So when the Velthara ambassador walked into the annex that Tuesday with 4 attendants and a gown that cost more than the building's annual maintenance budget, and when the senior diplomatic staff fanned out behind the conference room glass to watch her arrival like it was a solar event, I watched from the hallway with a cup of coffee and a quiet sort of curiosity that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with the language she was using with her attendants. She was speaking fast, clipped, upper register Veltheran with a Central Court accent. I had been studying that dialect for 3 years, using recovered texts from a pre-contact data core we had pulled from a decommissioned relay station near the outer belt. Hearing it spoken in person was extraordinary. It sounded like water moving over stone, with hard consonants that cracked like small branches underfoot. I went back to my desk and wrote down 17 new phonetic observations before lunch. The Velthara are the most politically powerful species in the 6-system trade corridor, which means every government on Earth had spent the last 2 decades trying very hard not to say the wrong thing to them. Their merchant fleets controlled access to 3 of the most productive mining regions in the sector. Their technology was not dramatically beyond ours, but their network of alliances was, and they knew it. They were polite about knowing it, which somehow made it worse. The new trade accords had been 3 years in negotiation. They covered mineral rights, transit lanes, medical data exchange, and 4 other categories of agreement that I had read about in the briefing document that came with my memo. The accords were almost finalized. Almost. The Veltheran High Court had 1 remaining condition, and that condition was old. It came from their legal tradition, something called the bonding clause of the accord ritual, which held that any agreement between peoples of significant political distance had to be sealed with a marriage between representatives of each side, not a symbolic one, a real one, with legal standing in Veltheran court records. Earth's council had agreed because they had no reasonable choice. The Velthara were not being unreasonable about it. In their culture, this was simply how trust was demonstrated at the highest level. It was not strange to them. It was not an insult. It was, from their perspective, a significant gift of status. The problem was choosing a representative. A politician would carry too much symbolic weight. A general would carry the wrong kind. A celebrity would make the entire thing look like a promotional event. What they needed, after several days of quiet panic in rooms I was not invited to, was someone who was genuinely unremarkable by every external measure. Someone who could enter the Veltheran court, smile politely, sign the documents, and not accidentally start a war over table manners. I do not know exactly how my name came up. I suspect it was someone looking through staff records for people who had some familiarity with Veltheran culture, however minimal, and who had no family complications, no political affiliations, no public profile, and no reason to behave dramatically. My file was, by every measurement that mattered to whoever made the decision, blank enough to be useful. They were not wrong. They just did not know what was written in the margins. Princess Seravin Althaval arrived the following week. I watched her delegation come through the main hall from my usual vantage point near the east corridor. She was tall for a Velthara, which meant she stood about even with my shoulder. Her complexion was the silver green that the Central Court bloodlines carried, deep and iridescent under direct light. She had 4 fingers on each hand, moving as she gestured to her attendants with the particular efficiency of someone who was always thinking 3 steps ahead. Her eyes were the hammered copper color that appeared in old Veltheron portrait carvings. They moved quickly and settled on nothing for long. She was escorted into the East Conference Room. I went and stood near the door. Her chief advisor, a tall man named Counselor Drath, spoke to her in a low tone while she reviewed the documents on the table. I heard him tell her that the human representative had been selected from a translation division. He said this the way someone might describe a piece of furniture being delivered. She nodded once. I was brought in a few minutes later by one of the junior diplomatic staff, who introduced me with a slightly anxious formality that I found more amusing than the situation probably warranted. Saravan looked at me with the same expression I imagined she used when reviewing supply manifests. Complete, precise, efficient, not unkind. Simply, thorough. "You are the chosen human?" she asked. Her translator pendant caught the words and delivered them in a flat, accented English that still somehow conveyed the particular weight she gave to the word chosen. "I am," I said. She nodded once. She turned to Drath and said, in fast Veltheran, that I seemed manageable. She said she hoped the ship's scholars would have something more interesting for her to study during the transit, since the weeks aboard would be long. She said that at least the human appeared to be calm, which was more than she had expected given the species' general reputation for overreaction. I smiled pleasantly and said nothing. Drath asked me, in English, whether I had any questions about the arrangement. "Just one," I said. "Will I have access to the ship's archives during transit?" There was a brief pause. Drath translated this for Saravan. She looked at me again, and for just a moment something shifted at the edge of her expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the very first sign of curiosity. "Yes," she said, through the pendant. "The archives will be available." "Then I have no concerns," I said. I was given 1 week to arrange my affairs. I packed 2 bags. One had clothes. The other had research notes, 3 personal data drives, a handwritten lexicon I had been building for 4 years, and a small book of Veltheran navigational poetry from the pre-contact period that I had translated myself and never published because I had not decided if the translation was good enough yet. I left my apartment in the condition I always left it, tidy, unlived-in looking, ready to return to without any sense of having been missed. The shuttle to the orbital dock left at dawn. I watched Earth fall away through the port window the same way I watched most things. Quietly, with attention, with the particular patience of a person who has learned that what happens next is almost always more interesting than what is happening now. I did not know then how right that was going to turn out to be. What I did know, sitting in that shuttle with my 2 bags and my coffee and my 4 years of unpublished work on a language that everyone around me assumed I had only glanced at, was that the Veltheron crown ship waiting at the orbital dock was the single largest repository of intact pre-contact Veltheron text in the known universe. And I was about to have access to all of it. Everything else I thought was just details. I could not have been more wrong about that. But it was a pleasant way to start. The crown ship was named the Irrelevan. In Old Veltheran, that word referred to a specific quality of light that exists just after a storm passes and before the sky fully clears. It was a word without a clean English equivalent, which I appreciated. Languages that had words for things other languages could not name were always the most interesting ones to work inside. The ship itself was enormous. It moved through the dock like a city deciding to take a short trip. Every surface was finished in the pale gold ceramic that Veltheron ship engineers favored, and the interior corridors ran in long, slightly curved lines that made the geometry feel organic rather than mechanical, as if the whole structure had grown rather than been built. There were over 400 people aboard, between crew and court staff, and the diplomatic retinue, and the various attendants and advisors, and junior functionaries who made the machinery of Veltheran court life run. I had a cabin on the 6th corridor, which was a respectful distance from both the royal quarters and the engine sections. The room was modest by Veltheran standards, which meant it was slightly larger than my apartment back home, and considerably better lit. There was a reading desk, a long window that looked out into open space, and a wall terminal that, after 2 hours of patient reformatting on my part, I had connected to the ship's archive network. The archive was even better than I had hoped. There were texts in there that had not been cataloged in any Earth database. There were navigational records from the early colonial period, legal documents from the first 3 dynasties, personal correspondence from scholars who had been dead for 600 years. There were 3 complete versions of an epic poem called the Vareth Sung, which I had only ever seen in fragments, and which dealt with the first great Veltheron migration across the inner systems, in a style that was part history and part something that functioned like mythology, the boundary between those two things being considerably blurrier in Veltheron tradition than in Earth's. I spent the first 2 days barely leaving the cabin. On the 3rd day, the cultural exchange program began. This was the official framework that the diplomatic staff on both sides had agreed on for the pre-wedding period. Saravan and I were expected to spend time together each day, learning about each other's customs, participating in joint activities that the court had arranged, and generally demonstrating to the assembled Veltheran nobility that this union was something other than a purely administrative transaction, which it was, but the court had a form to maintain, and I respected that. The sessions were not unpleasant. They were simply not particularly deep on either side. At first, we ate meals in a shared dining room, under the polite supervision of several attendants. We were shown each other's traditional artifacts, explained to each other with the particular careful politeness of 2 people who have agreed to be considerate, before they have agreed to be honest. Saravan was unfailingly correct. She asked sensible questions. She answered mine in clear, measured sentences, delivered through her translator pendant with no visible sign of what she actually thought about anything. It was, I recognized, exactly the same face I was showing her. Her court, however, was a different matter. The Veltharan nobility did not bother to be discreet around me. I was, as far as every single one of them was concerned, a human who spoke no Veltharan, had no political standing, and represented a species that was, at best, a minor point of diplomatic interest. They spoke freely in my presence the way people speak freely in front of furniture. It was not malicious. It was simply comfortable assumption. I let them be comfortable. Councillor Drath was the most active. He was a careful man with a long face, and the kind of controlled gestures that came from decades in political environments where every movement was watched. He had been Saravan's family advisor for 11 years, which meant he was deeply invested in the outcomes of this marriage, in ways that had nothing to do with Saravan's happiness, and everything to do with the court's structure of power. He spoke to her most evenings in the corridor outside her quarters, and the corridor outside her quarters happened to pass along the wall adjacent to a small reading alcove that I had discovered on the 2nd day and had since made a habit of occupying after dinner. He told her, on the 4th evening, that the treaty language around resource access was too generous to Earth, and that he intended to address it during the final ratification discussions. He had a proposal ready that would shift 3 of the most favorable transit clauses from permanent to renewable on a 5-year cycle, which would give the Veltharan court ongoing leverage that the current language did not provide. I noted this. I went back to my cabin. I opened the treaty document I had downloaded from the diplomatic network on the 1st day, and read those clauses very carefully. Then I opened a new document and began drafting amendments. It was on the 5th day that Saravan found me in the archive wing. I had gone there in the late afternoon, when the corridor traffic was light, to work on a particular section of the Vareth Sung that I had been puzzling over. The 3rd canto used a compound tense construction that appeared nowhere else in surviving Veltharan literature, and I had 3 competing theories about what it meant, and no way to resolve them without access to comparative texts from the same period. The archive wing had 3 of those texts. I had been cross-referencing them for an hour when I heard footsteps and looked up. Saravan stood in the doorway. She was alone, which surprised me. She was wearing a plain overrobe rather than court dress, which surprised me more. She looked at me, then at the text spread across the reading surface, then at the specific passage I had open on the main screen. She was very still for a moment. "You are reading the Vareth Sung," she said. The pendant translated it, but she had not been using the pendant at the volume needed to reach me. The words had come through as Veltheran first, and my response to the Veltheran was what gave me away. My eyes moved to her face before I had consciously processed that I had understood the words. That fraction of a second told her something. She was too sharp to miss it. She walked in and sat down across from me without asking. "You can read this," she said. Not a question. "Most of it," I said. I said it in Veltharan, because there was not much point in the pretense anymore. The third canto is giving me difficulty. The compound tense in the second stanza. There are 3 ways to read it, and I cannot find enough comparative examples to be certain which is correct. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at me. "How long have you been studying our language?" she asked. 4 years for the written form, I said. I started on the spoken elements about 18 months ago. I am still working on tonal calibration. She was quiet for a moment. Her copper eyes moved across my face in that same methodical way they moved across everything, taking inventory. "You heard everything," she said, "in the corridor, at meals." "Yes," I said. "And you said nothing. You seemed comfortable." I did not want to interrupt. Another pause. She leaned back slightly. "Why?" she asked. It was a fair question. I considered it genuinely before answering, because I have found over many years that people reveal considerably more of themselves when they believe they are not being observed, and because I was curious about who you were before anyone gave you a reason to perform for me. She looked at me for a long time. The ship hummed around us. Somewhere in the corridor, 2 junior staff members passed by with a cart, and the sound faded. "That is either very wise or very calculating," she said finally. "It can be both," I said. She almost smiled. I almost would have said she almost smiled. She pulled the main screen slightly toward her and looked at the third canto passage I had been working on. "The compound tense here is called the Veltharan form," she said. "It does not translate directly. It describes an action that has not yet happened, but has already become inevitable. The closest concept in your linguistic tradition would be something between a future tense and a statement of fate, but neither is accurate." I sat forward. This was exactly what I had been looking for, and had not been able to find in any of the comparative texts. "Then the subject of the stanza," I said, "is not choosing to leave. The Veltharan form means the leaving has already been decided by something larger than the character's will." "Correct," she said. "That completely changes the emotional weight of the canto," I said, probably with more feeling than I intended. "Yes," she said, and then, quietly, as if testing the words, "It does." We sat there for another 2 hours. She corrected 4 of my phonetic assumptions and confirmed 7 of my translation choices, and I showed her a structural analysis I had done of the metric patterns in the first canto that she said no Veltharan scholar had produced in the same form before, which I found immensely satisfying. At no point during those 2 hours did either of us mention the wedding, the treaty, the court, or Councillor Drath's plans for the renewable transit clauses. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the doorway. "You are not what they sent you as," she said. "No," I agreed. "Who are you?" she asked, not for the last time. "Someone who reads carefully," I said. She left. I sat for a while looking at the third canto passage with the Veltharan verb form underlined, thinking about actions that had not yet happened, but had already become inevitable, and I thought that was a very interesting thing for a language to have a word for. And then, 5 days before the wedding ceremony, Lord Everin Soth arrived. He came aboard at the mid-route resupply station, which I had not known was happening. He arrived with his own small retinue and was given quarters on the second corridor, which was considerably closer to the royal section than mine. He was introduced to me at dinner that evening as a decorated military commander and long-standing associate of the High Court. He looked at me the way predators look at things they have already decided about. I looked back at him with the same mild pleasantness I gave everyone. Drath greeted him with the particular warmth of someone who had been expecting him. They spoke at length that evening in the corridor outside the dining hall. I heard every word. Drath had arranged this. Everon had expected to marry Saravan before the diplomatic accord changed the arrangement. He was here now because Drath had sent for him, and Drath had sent for him because there was a Veltharan legal tradition called the Kauthris. The Kauthris was a formal challenge. If a Veltharan male of sufficient rank and standing issued a challenge to the intended partner of a royal bride before the bonding ceremony was completed, the bride was honor-bound by her house to allow it. The match was open combat form, The winner claimed the right to stand in the ceremony. It was an old law, one of the oldest in their tradition, and it had been designed in an era when strength was the most reliable way to determine who would best protect a royal house. It was, by current standards, almost never invoked. Almost. I sat with that information for a quiet moment. Then I went back to my cabin and finished the treaty amendment document I had been working on. I reviewed it twice, then I made a second copy, encrypted both, and saved them to 2 separate drives. Everin issued the challenge the following evening. It was done at formal dinner, in front of the entire assembled court. He stood at his place at the table, addressed the room in the formal register that the Kauthris required, named me directly, and invoked the right of challenge. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has just shifted beyond the point of returning to where it was. Saravin sat very still at the head of the table. She did not look at Everan. She looked at her plate, and then she looked at me, and her face held an expression I was still learning to read. There was something in it that might have been dread, and something that might have been a silent apology, and something underneath both of those things that I could not name yet. She had no power to refuse the challenge on my behalf. The Kauthris was a matter of house honor. Refusing it would be a stain on her family's court record that would outlast everyone in the room. I set down my fork. I looked at Everon. He was watching me with the patient certainty of someone who had already calculated the outcome. I accept, I said. In Veltharan, in the formal register, without hesitation. The silence changed shape. Everan's certainty developed a small crack in it. Just small. He recovered quickly. The court began to murmur. Drath's expression did something complicated. Saravin looked at me. I looked back at her. Her copper eyes were wide and unreadable and very, very focused. The human knows our tongue, Everin said. The human has known it for some time, I said pleasantly. I accept your challenge under the full terms of the Kauthris. Open combat form. No clan-bonded augments. Witnessed by the full court. Shall we set the date? He set it for 3 days hence. He did not look certain anymore, but he was far too proud to withdraw. I returned to my dinner. The 3 days between Everan's challenge and the match were not quiet. Everan trained in the ship's exercise wing every morning for 3 hours. I heard about this from a junior staff member who mentioned it at breakfast with the mild tone of someone passing along information they believed I would find alarming. I thanked him and asked whether the archive wing was open in the early afternoon. He confirmed that it was. I went and worked on the Veroth Sung translation for 2 hours. 4 separate people came to my cabin in those 3 days with some variation of the same offer. One of them was a court ambassador. One was a junior diplomat from the Earth Annex who had accompanied the delegation and now looked as though he deeply regretted the assignment. One was one of Drath's own junior advisors, which I found interesting, and one was a minor Veltharan noble whose exact relationship to the situation I could not fully determine, but who spoke in the careful way of someone delivering a message they had been given, rather than one they had composed. The message was always the same, dressed in different clothes. There was a way out. The challenge could be redirected. A medical declaration, a diplomatic technicality, a quiet negotiation behind closed doors. Everin would accept a settlement. Earth would still get most of what it needed. And I could step aside without anyone having to say directly that the reason I was stepping aside was that I could not win. I declined each one. On the second night, Saravin came herself. She arrived at my door at a late hour, wearing the plain robe again, alone. When I opened the door, she looked at me for a moment before speaking. "You do not have to do this," she said, in Veltharan quietly. "There are ways to end it that preserve the treaty. Earth does not have to lose the accord over one challenge." "I know," I said. "Come in." She came in. She stood near the reading desk and looked at the documents spread across it, the treaty amendments, the archive notes, the Veroth Sung translation, with its pages of margin notes in 2 languages. "You have been working," she said. "I work most evenings," I said. I sat down. "Would you like to see what I have been working on?" She sat down across from me. I turned the treaty amendment document toward her. She read it. She was a fast reader. I watched her eyes move down the page. She turned to the second page, then the third. She stopped on the 4th page, which addressed the Renewable Transit Clause amendment that Drath had been planning, and she read that section twice. When she looked up, her expression had changed. "You heard him," she said. In the corridor, on the fourth evening, I said. He told you the same plan and outline on the sixth evening. He gave you less detail that time, which I thought was interesting. He was testing whether I would ask questions, she said, very quietly. That was my interpretation as well. She set the document down. She was very still for a moment. Kale, she said, and it was the first time she had used my name without the formal address. Why have you not told anyone about this? Because it is more useful as a document than as an accusation, I said. Once the Calthris is resolved, I intend to submit those amendments through the formal ratification channel. They are legally sound. The original treaty language actually supports most of them. Anyone reviewing the accord carefully can see what Drath's proposed changes would do to the balance of the agreement. She looked at me. There was something happening in her expression that I was watching carefully. You planned this, she said. I planned for several possibilities, I said. This is one of the ones I considered. And the challenge? I accepted the challenge because I intend to win it, I said, and because I did not think walking away from a public threat was the right message for Earth to send in the first week of a new diplomatic relationship, even a quiet one. Everin has been trained in formal combat since he was 12 years old, she said. He is one of the most decorated competitors in the High Court's history. I know, I said. You know, she repeated. You know, and you still. Yes. She looked at me for a very long time. There was something behind her eyes that I still did not have a word for, not in English or Veltharan. You are going to get hurt, she said. Probably not, I said. Another long pause. Who are you? She asked. That question again. She asked it the way someone asks a question they are starting to believe they have already partially answered, and are not sure how to feel about the answer. I handed her the top page of the treaty amendments. Someone who read the fine print, I said. Get some sleep, Saravan. She stood. She held the document. She looked at it and then at me. I will review this tonight, she said. I hoped you might, I said. She left. I sat at the desk for a while. The space outside the window was very black and very full. After a while I went back to the third canto of the Vareth Sung, and the Vel Sarin verb form, and the idea of actions that had not yet happened, but had already become inevitable. There is a particular quality to the hours before something that cannot be undone. I have felt it before. It does not feel like fear, exactly. It feels more like clarity. Like every unnecessary thing has already been sorted out, and what remains is simply what is true. I knew what was true. I had known it since I accepted the challenge at that dinner table. The match day arrived with the ordinary business of morning. I ate breakfast. I read for an hour. I went to the arena. The Veltharan combat arena on the Irrelevan was a dedicated space on the third level, crystalline-walled, high-ceilinged, with tiered observation seating that curved around two sides. The floor was pale and very clear. The Veltharan kept their formal arenas that way deliberately. A floor that showed everything that happened on it was considered part of the ritual. Nothing was hidden in the Calthris. Nothing was allowed to be minimized. The entire court was present. Every tier of seating was occupied. I walked in through the eastern entrance and I heard the sound of the room change, not loudly, but distinctly. The particular kind of attention that collects in a space when something unexpected is happening. Everan was already on the floor. He was in formal match gear, which among the Velthara was minimal and functional. He was broad across the shoulders and moved with the balanced ease of someone who had been trained so thoroughly that the training had stopped being training and had simply become the way his body worked. He looked at me with calm, absolute confidence. I looked back at him with the same mild pleasantness I had been giving everyone since I boarded this ship. The presiding officer of the court read the formal declaration of the Calthris, the rules of the open combat form, the conditions of the outcome. No clan-bonded augments. Closed form strikes only below a certain threshold. Match ended by submission, incapacitation, or formal concession. It was not designed to be lethal. It was designed to be definitive. I had two requests, which I submitted through the proper channel. First, that the match record be included in the official court archive. Second, that the Earth Diplomatic Annex receive a copy of that record within 48 hours of the match's conclusion. Both were granted without comment. though Drath looked at me when they were read aloud with an expression that had begun to develop a specific quality. It was the expression of a man who was starting to do arithmetic he did not like. Saravan sat in the front row of the observation tier. She had not spoken to me since last night. She looked at me now with those copper eyes, and something in her face that I still could not fully translate. The presiding officer stepped back. Everin moved first. He was fast, technically excellent, fully committed. His approach style was aggressive and controlled in the way that came from a specific formal school of Veltharan combat, one I had studied in detail from records of 3 previous matches I had obtained through the diplomatic archive network before boarding the ship. I knew his favored entry angles. I knew his dominant side and how he compensated for his offside. I knew that he liked to establish positional advantage in the first 30 seconds, and that if he succeeded in doing so, he was very difficult to dislodge. I did not let him establish it. The first 90 seconds I moved in a way that gave him nothing to read. I was not aggressive, I was not passive, I was simply present in each moment and gone before he could build on it. I felt him recalibrate. I felt the tiny adjustment in his footwork that meant he was shifting strategy. I let him shift. Then I began. The Interstellar Combat League was not something most people in diplomatic circles thought to look up. It operated in a specific space between visible and invisible, covered thoroughly in certain networks, and essentially absent from others. It ran open-form matches between representatives of multiple species, non-lethal but absolutely genuine, and its records went back 22 years. I had competed for 11 of those years. I had won the open circuit 4 consecutive times. I held victories over competitors from 9 different species. My approach to combat had been described, in various match records, as methodical, adaptive, and disquieting to opponents who expected a readable style. I did not hurt Everon. I want to be precise about that. I had no interest in humiliating him beyond what the Kauthras required, and I had even less interest in creating a diplomatic incident by doing unnecessary damage to a decorated member of the Veltharan High Court. So I was careful. I was precise. I gave him moments where he could demonstrate that he was skilled, because he was skilled, genuinely and impressively so. And then, gradually, I showed him why that was not enough. The match lasted 6 minutes. At the end of it, Everin was on the floor, breathing carefully, looking up at the crystal ceiling with the expression of a man who was in the process of rebuilding his entire understanding of what had just happened. The room was completely silent. I extended my hand to him. It was an Earth custom. He looked at it for a moment, and then he took it, slowly, and I helped him to his feet. He said nothing, but his grip was firm and deliberate, and I understood from that what it cost him, and respected him for it. I turned. I found Saravan in the front row. She was standing. She was very still. In the formal Veltharan register, I said, "I believe the Kauthras is concluded." The presiding officer confirmed it. The record was sealed. The court remained in that particular silence. That meant the moment was being absorbed rather than processed. Saravan came down from the tier. She crossed the arena floor toward me, and the court watched her, and she did not look at any of them. She stopped directly in front of me. She looked up. "You have been lying to us," she said quietly. "I have been quiet," I said. "There is a difference. You knew our language from the first day. Yes. You heard everything Drath said. Every word. You knew who Everan was before he boarded. I had his match records from the diplomatic archive. Yes. You let them believe you were nothing. It was more useful that way." She held my gaze. Her copper eyes were very steady and very close. Around us, the court was still silent, still watching, still in that held breath quality of a room where something is happening that no one quite has language for yet. "Why?" she said. "Why not simply tell us who you were?" I had thought about this question since the night she first asked it. I had thought about what the true answer was, as opposed to the strategic one. "Because I wanted to see who you were first," I said, "when you thought I was nobody, before you knew there was a reason to treat me differently, before you had to calculate what I meant to you." The silence stretched. "And who was I?" she asked, very quietly. "The most interesting person I had met in a very long time," I said. "You sat down with me in the archive wing and spent 2 hours arguing about verb tenses in a 600-year-old poem. You were irritated that I had found a structural pattern your own scholars had missed, and then you stopped being irritated because you were too interested in the pattern. You read the treaty amendments last night, and you thought about Drath's plan before you thought about the challenge, which tells me what you actually care about. You came to my door to offer me a way out that would have cost you something and saved me nothing, and you did it anyway. A very long pause. You, she said slowly, are an extremely strange human. I have been told, I said. And then she smiled. It was the first full smile I had seen from her, and it changed her face entirely, opened it up, made her look younger and less guarded, and entirely real, and I thought it was possibly the best thing I had seen since I had come aboard this ship. Which, given that the ship contained several hundred priceless archive texts, was saying something considerable. The first thing that happened after the Kauthris was that Drath tendered his resignation from the position of Chief Court Advisor. He did this before the court session the following morning, privately, in writing, and Saravan accepted it without comment. Later she told me he had made a calculation that leaving voluntarily would preserve more of his long-term standing than waiting to be formally removed. She said this with the flat tone of someone describing a weather event rather than a betrayal, and I understood that she had known for longer than the last 3 days that Drath was building something that was not in her interest. Did you know before you boarded? I asked. I suspected, she said. I did not have evidence. I have quite a lot of evidence, I said, if it would be useful. She looked at me. Of course you do, she said. The second thing that happened was the treaty ratification session. It ran for 2 full days. The Veltharan High Court representatives and the Earth diplomatic delegation sat at the same table for the first time, without the overlay of the matrimonial arrangement hanging over the proceedings, and the discussion was direct and considerably more substantive than the preliminary sessions had been. I submitted the amendment document through the formal channel. It was reviewed, questioned, debated, and ultimately adopted in the form I had written it, with minor modifications on 2 clauses that the Veltharan side legitimately had grounds to adjust. The Earth delegation was, to put it plainly, stunned. 3 of them came to find me afterward. The senior diplomat, a serious woman named Caroline Marsh, who had been working the Veltharan brief for 7 years, stood in the corridor outside the ratification chamber and looked at me with an expression that combined professional appreciation and profound personal discomfort. Where did the amendments come from? She asked. I drafted them, I said. Based on what? 4 years of studying their legal language and 3 weeks of listening carefully, I said. She opened her mouth, closed it. You speak Veltharan, fluently, more or less. Kale, she said, you have been working in the sub-basement translating data cores. Yes, I said. It is very good work. She stared at me for a long moment. Who are you? It was, I reflected, becoming something of a recurring question in my life. The third thing that happened was the wedding ceremony. It took place on the 47th day, in the crystal dome at the top of the Irrelevan, where the ceiling curved away into open space, and the stars were visible in every direction. There were 200 members of the Veltharan court present, and 6 members of the Earth diplomatic delegation, which was the correct number given the space and the occasion. The ceremony itself was conducted in both languages simultaneously. The presiding court official read the Veltharan form. Caroline Marsh read the Earth form beside her. It was not a long ceremony. The Veltharan tradition valued precision over elaboration in formal moments. You said what was true. You witnessed it together. You signed the record. Saravan stood beside me during the ceremony in full court dress. She looked precisely as she should, composed and dignified and present. At one point, during the Veltharan portion of the recitation, the presiding official used a phrase that was technically correct, but came from a slightly archaic form of the ceremonial language that I suspected most of the court recognized only by rote rather than meaning. I glanced at Saravan. She glanced at me. Something passed between us in that glance that did not need translation. We signed the record. The court witnessed it. The stars outside the dome continued their indifferent and ancient business. Afterward, there was a formal reception. I stood with a glass of something warm and pale that the Veltharan called celebration drink, and which tasted like sweetened mineral water. and I watched the room manage its reaction to the events of the preceding week. It was, as social events went, a very interesting room to observe. There were people who were recalibrating their positions. There were people who were deciding whether to approach me and concluding that they needed more information first. There were 2 junior court officials who were clearly writing mental notes as fast as they could. Irrelevan appeared beside me at some point in the middle of the reception. She stood near enough that we were clearly together, without requiring it to be declared. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Which part?" "Any of it," I considered. "Strange," I said, "but not unpleasantly." "You are surrounded by people trying to decide what you are," she said. "They can take their time," I said. "I am not going anywhere." She was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "No, I suppose you are not." We did not talk about what the marriage meant beyond the ceremony that night. We were both too careful for that, and both, I think, too honest to pretend the careful part was finished. What we were to each other beyond the document we had both signed was a question that had its own timeline, and I had learned enough from 3 years of working in languages that did not rush to know that some things developed at their own pace and arrived when they were ready. What I did know was that when I returned to my cabin that night and sat at the reading desk, I was not working on translation out of habit or avoidance. I was working because I was genuinely happy, which had always been the truest reason I worked on anything. The weeks that followed settled into a shape I had not anticipated, and found I did not want to change. Mornings were for the individual business of the ship, which continued its work regardless of the social reorganization that had taken place around it. Afternoons varied. I had been given extended archive access, which was not a small thing. The Velteran archivists were initially cautious with me, then curious. Then, in the case of the senior archivist, an elderly woman named Petra, who had worked with those texts for 30 years, openly and enthusiastically interested in what I was doing with the Verath Sung analysis. I shared the full translation with her on the 12th day. She read it in an afternoon, and came back the next morning with 14 annotations and a question about my interpretation of the 4th canto's final stanza, that we then discussed for 3 hours and did not fully resolve. It was one of the most satisfying mornings I had spent in years. Irrelevan began joining me in the archive wing in the evenings. This was not announced or arranged. It simply started happening, the way some things do, as a natural extension of what was already there. She would arrive with something she had been reading, or a question that had come up in her own work, and we would sit across from each other at the wide reading desk and work in companionable parallel, or argue about something specific when the work intersected. She was working on a study of early Veltheron diplomatic correspondence, specifically letters between the first 3 dynasty periods, and she had a scholar's fury about incomplete records and a diplomat's precise sense of what a word choice in a treaty letter could mean about the relationship between its signatories. When those 2 things combined, she was the sharpest thinker I had seen in a long time. I told her this one evening. She looked up from her document and studied me the way she had studied me the first time she found me in this room. "You say things like that very simply," she said. "They are simple things," I said. "Most people make them complicated," she said. "Most people are worried about how the observation will be received," I said. "I am usually more interested in whether it is accurate." A pause. "And is it accurate," she said, "that I am the sharpest thinker you have encountered? Among people I have personally spent time with," I said, "in the specific intersection of linguistic analysis and political inference." "Yes." She considered this. "You have spent time with a considerable range of people," she said. "I have," I said. "From 9 different species according to the ICL records," she said. I looked up. She had been doing her own reading. 11 years of competition, she said. 4 open circuit titles. A match record in Veltheran archives that several members of my court apparently recognized immediately and said nothing about, because they assumed it was a different human with the same name. "It was not," I said. "I know," she said. "I read the biographical record. There is only one Kale Oren in the ICL system." I sat with that for a moment. "Are you angry?" I asked. "No," she said. She thought about it. "I was, briefly. That first night, after you showed me the treaty amendments, I was angry for about an hour that you had known so much and said so little. A pause. Then I remembered what you said, that you wanted to see who I was before I knew there was a reason to perform for you. Yes. And I thought about who I was in those first weeks, she said, before I knew. You were exactly who you are now, I said. That was the point. The silence that followed was different from most silences. It had weight in it, but not uncomfortable weight. The kind that exists when something has been said correctly, and both people know it, and neither one needs to add to it. Teach me something, she said finally. What would you like to know? Something from a language I do not know, she said. Something that does not translate. I thought for a moment. There is a word in an old Earth language called Portuguese, I said. The word is saudade. It describes a specific kind of longing for something or someone that you love, combined with the knowledge that the thing you are longing for is already part of you. You cannot separate the missing from the having. They exist at the same time. She was quiet. There is no Veltheron equivalent? I asked. There is something close, she said slowly. The word Thalsovara. It means the ache of distance from a thing that has already changed you. A pause. It is considered a very old word. It appears mostly in early poetry. Like the Vareth sung, I said. Like the Vareth sung, she said. We sat with both words in the air between us for a while. The archive hummed. The stars outside the window moved in the slow way they always moved, which was not movement at all by human scale, but which the Velthara had a specific navigational term for. A word that described the apparent shift of distant light across a long enough period of observation. I had been in the middle of translating that word when she had first walked into this room. I thought that there was something very precise about the way this had all unfolded. Not planned exactly, not lucky exactly, more like the Velsaran form, the form that described an action not yet completed, but already made inevitable by what had come before it. On the 31st day of our marriage, I was sitting at the reading desk with 2 mugs of the warm Veltheron tea that I had developed a genuine preference for, working on what was now a joint translation project that Saravan and I had started 3 weeks prior. A complete annotated edition of the Vareth sung in both languages with facing page comparison and a full scholarly apparatus. Petra had already told us it was going to be the definitive academic text on the subject. I thought she might be right. Saravan thought the 4th canto still needed more work, and she was probably also right. The door opened. Saravan came in with her archive tablet and a new notation she had developed for the tonal register markings, which we had been arguing about the system for all week, and she set it in front of me without preamble. Look at this, she said. If we use this system in the 2nd canto, the metric pattern becomes visible without the color annotations. It reduces the page count by 4. I looked at it. It was elegant. It was also slightly different from the convention her own scholars used, which would require a note in the introduction. We will need to justify the deviation in the apparatus, I said. I have already written the justification, she said, sitting down across from me. It is in the appendix draft. Of course it is, I said. She picked up the mug of tea I had placed on her side of the desk and drank from it without looking up from the notation system. An entirely ordinary motion. The motion of someone who had decided, without announcing it, that this desk and these evenings, and this work, and this person across from her, were simply where things were now. I looked at her for a moment, the iridescent light in her complexion, the way her copper eyes moved across the page with that focused efficiency that meant she was thinking faster than she was reading, the slight angle of her head when something interested her specifically. I thought about the sub-basement office on Earth, where I had read the memo over my 2nd cup of coffee, and confirmed by end of business without fully knowing why. I thought I probably knew why now. I did not say any of this out loud. I am a quiet person, and the Vel-Saren things, the ones that are already made inevitable by what has come before, do not always need to be named. Sometimes they just need to be present in. I turned back to the notation system on the page in front of me. Outside the window, the stars continued their slow, ancient work. The ship moved through the dark the way it always moved, purposefully, and without hurry, and inside the archive the 2 of us sat across from each other, in the particular silence of people who are no longer strangers, and worked.